Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 77 in the book of Genesis. And we're going to ask a difficult question today is how do unfavorable people enjoy the favor of God? It's a great question. So essentially, it's how do sinners go to heaven? That is, how do two disequal things match up? How does heavenly math work? Here's the problem. You've got imperfect people trying to have a relationship with the perfect God. And how do imperfect people get to spend eternity with a perfect God? And how do sinners fellowship with holiness and with the holy God? It's an interesting question. Well, it's answered in today's passage, which is in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. It's a big theme of the Bible, so we have to talk about it again. And that is Genesis 15:6. And he, Abram, believed God, believed the Lord, and he, the Lord, counted it to him as righteousness. So he, Abraham, believes he does something, and he, God, counts it to him as righteousness. So Abraham does what he can do. He believes, he trusts, he votes with his mental confidence in the Lord. And then Abraham's account is credited as if he is a righteous person, as if he is a perfectly holy person. So here's how unrighteous people become right before God. So remember back in Genesis 6, in verse 5, it has this horrible thing that's is said about human beings, which is every intent is only ever evil about humans. So you may say, well, how does a person with every intent only ever evil get to be with God? Well, today's passage answers that. It answers how unfavorable people enjoy the favor of God. So how do we get good enough to be with God? How do we earn heaven, so to speak? Well, you don't, and you can't. Heaven is given. Heaven is not earned. A relationship with God is granted. It's not merited in the least by us. So this is how an expectation, what we're talking about today, is an expectation for every single person that comes to the Lord. Everybody, every Jew, every Christian that comes to the Lord has to go through this step of Abram, if you will. It's the definitive example. You have to do this. This is authoritative for everybody, whether you're a podcast listener, a podcaster, you have to do what Abraham does in this passage. Well, how do we know that? How can I be so strong about that? Well, the rest of the Bible continually comes back to this moment. So sometimes in the Bible, this concept is literally spoken word for word. For example, Romans chapter 4, what shall we say then was gained by Abraham, our forefather in the flesh. For if Abraham was justified by works, he's got something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? And then in quotes, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So that's the direct quote from what we're doing today in Genesis chapter 15. And then sometimes in the New Testament, it's indirectly repeated. For example, in Ephesians chapter 2, for by grace you've been saved through faith, not your own doing. It's the gift of God, not as a result of works, that no one may boast. So this light bulb that goes on in Abram's soul of belief, hey, I gotta believe, this is absolutely required for your soul. It's something that happens from Abraham. Abraham does something in today's passage. But the really important stuff is what is done for Abraham, and that is this grace of God is crediting Abraham. So we talked about yesterday, this is where Abram's $100 deposit into his 401k is matched by God's $1 billion deposit into his 401k account. So in the principles of God's economy, this little teeny belief gains the benefit that are sort of unearned. And it is there in this impossible and inconvenient and incredible wrestling that we have in faith with God that we believe and God credits us. So our small deposit gives birth to righteousness. So here's how unrighteous people become right before God. This is how people with every intent, only ever evil, makes us okay before God. So your account has enough, not because of what you put in, it's because of what God puts in. And our small bits of faith allow Him to credit us with being viewed as acceptable and perfect and right, and just like His Son. So our righteousness is based not on our achievements, but on our belief, which then offers access to the achievements of Christ. So today we're going to, the charge is, hey, call on Him and trust Him. So something happens from Abraham, which is belief and trust and faith. John 1:12, my salvation verse says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." So there, something happens for Abraham. God does the heavy lifting. He lifts for Abraham. So this is how a knucklehead gets fellowship with God. So you, Mr. and Mrs. Podcast listener knucklehead, and me, podcast giver knucklehead, get the same fellowship with God that Abraham got, and which was in Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, "I am your great reward. You get me." We get the same mega reward as Abraham. So if we put $100 of faith into our spiritual 401k, we get this $1 billion of benefit. It's the story of rescue. The whole Bible's been the story so far of rescue. So in the garden, He rescues Abraham, or Adam and Eve, where He turns back to Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. And Noah on the boat is when he gets off the boat, he finds God there, fortunately. And now we see here again God turning towards Abram. God's turning towards mankind. He offers a relationship with sinners. He is faithful to the unfaithful, us. He credits our little teeny baby faith with great righteousness. So our little faith achieves relationship, achieves access, and being right before Him. So by faith, unfavorable people enjoy the favor of God because of His crediting, His counting it towards us. So today, you got to have the faith of Abraham. Thanks for listening.